I'm just going to go to a pen pointer here. Okay, I'm going to start with a couple of definitions here. One, a family of four living in poverty must survive on approximately $24,000 a year. That definition is not great, but it undershoots. But this is the one that the Census Bureau uses, and so therefore it's pretty broadly used, and it does give us a measuring tool. So as long as we know that in actuality, this is actually low.
So John, does that mean that you actually have to be classified as poor? A family of four must make less than 24,455
for a family of four. Yeah.
And if you make that much or more, then you're not considered poor.
That's right. That's how they figure their poverty figures. Now they do make some exceptions. They go up to, you know, like some things are termed like at 125% of this figure, right. Some 200%. It depends on what they're right. trying to talk about there. So the big thing here is with it, if this is what your family is getting by on, you're not getting by.
Yes.
There's not enough to meet your family needs. So something is always going to be missing. It could be food, it could be shelter, it could be clothes, it could be all of those. And so your needs are not being met with the family. I always bring this one up too. How close is our DNA? We're about 99.95% the same in DNA. Humanity across the board is the same. I even had to do this presentation for the grand rounds at the upstate Golisano Children's Hospital, and I was talking to 70 doctors and med students, and I thought, do I put this slide in there? And I thought, yeah, I'm going to put it in because this is something we tend to forget, is that across the board, DNA is the same. The genes are the same. And so it's highly likely that for these two guys, they might be closer in DNA than these two or even these two. You can't tell. There are these little things, but across the board, our DNA is the same. Now, so I also want to just take a brief look at this particular statistic. This one is from the 2016 U.S. Census, poverty in the United States. In poverty, we had about 12, well, in poverty, we had about 40 million. That was 12.7% of the population. The white population was in poverty, had about 27 million. That was 11.6% of the white population. And the black population was about 9,234,000. And that was 24% of the black population. And I'd like to look at these because if I were to ask in Rochester, in the United States, what color is the face of poverty? I'm sure the answer would be black. But you can see here that in the United States, for every one black person, you have 3 white people in poverty. So the numbers here may be different than we think them to be. We have to keep that in mind. And then we get another little incongruity over here. White people are in poverty. Well, we can see that black people enter poverty at twice the rate of white people. And to my mind, this is a glaring example of what we call structural racism. This happens, these figures are basically the same, this gap, for the last 50 or 60 years that the census has been reporting them in this way. And there's no other way to explain this. If the DNA is the same across the board, if the genes are the same across the board, how can this population be entering poverty at more than twice the rate that this population is entering poverty? So I want to give you a little bit about how I got into this. And it was after I had retired from teaching, I took over a church committee in Pittsford. We were living in Pittsford at the time. And one of the things I did was get involved with the Rochester Children's Zone. One of the guys on my committee there was a guy named Bartolo, I think it was. Yes. He's an introvert, Don Bartolo. And we were on this committee for probably 2 years. And what I found was that I met wonderful people and quite a few residents through the process. But I realized I did not see change being made. So at the same time, I got involved with a drop-in center over on with a church on Portland Avenue. And I worked with kids. My wife and I helped them play games, and they wound up eating there for the evening. And I really started to get to know people. But again, we were kind of helping out in ways that were more along the charitable lines, but wasn't seeing change in what I thought should be happening with poverty. I got involved with the Free Facing Race, Embracing Equity committees that was supposed to be looking at problems with education. And I began to see there some clashing between what is poverty, what is race, and there were some entanglements there, I thought, with trying to figure out what was the difference between the two and trying to solve problems. So what I had to do is I left that committee. I was still on RCZ, and then I was still working with the drop-in center. But I just left that committee and I went home and I just started writing a list of impacts to try to understand poverty for myself. I kept race on the side because I knew I didn't understand what was going on there and why. But with poverty, how could people get into this and stay in it? So I just started listing things like this. In poverty, people make decisions based on survival. Rule number one really is that Dr. Fred Rogash over at the Mount Hope Family Center says, you survive the day, and the next day you start all over and survive that day. And if that's the way your life is going, that does not bode well for career, education, because those are long-term obligations, and these survival is a daily change. Number two, I wrote down kids of poverty speak in casual register while their teachers use formal register. I thought, yeah, this is going to present a problem for a kid first day in class. His teacher is talking in a totally different way. Number three, kids of poverty have half the vocabulary. This was a stunner. This comes out of the Hart-Risley test. Betty Hart and Todd Risley, they were University of Kansas researchers. And if DNA is the same across the board, and genes are the same across the board, distributed equally across the board, how can kids of poverty have half the vocabulary? What is going on there? So we notice a couple of things as we start to look at a pileup of things, impacts. And the other thing that's probably going through your mind is how long is he going to go on with this stuff, because it's going to drive me nuts. And usually, even when writing about this, you can mention three things like this, but now if I'm going to tack on a fourth, a fifth, and a sixth, where do you put them in your head? It becomes hard to juggle them. So what I started to do, what I've done for you here, is to boil these down to one word. That kids in poverty also have trouble in reading. They have different realities than we do, and they're judged differently than we do by class system. They live with shame, hidden rules that are different for the classes, and they can't get their needs met. They often lack a sufficient inner voice because they don't have the vocabulary now to guide them through the individual problem solving that they have. Their parents speak to them with more pejoratives. They tend to withdraw. Their parents speak to them with fewer words, much fewer words. Children in poverty speak fewer words to their parents. This is all out of the Hart and Risley test. kids have trouble identifying consequences. They're not going to college. They live in noise. They're absent 20% of the time, at least, and they get intimidated by all of the systems around them, including the school system, the sheriff system, the health system. It's hard to understand, and it's scary for them to enter because they're in a different place. So we're up to 20 things now that all of these things are piled on people in poverty all of the time. And we're just really getting started here. So I kept on writing these down as I got them. They get evicted. Discipline in school is tough for them. They don't graduate. They don't get GEDs. They're feeling pressure all the time. They don't take AP courses that kids in Pittsburgh or Brighton or Fairport would take. Teachers are often disrespected, and we keep on getting things like this. And just take a look at the geometry here. And so, but I'm writing these things down and realizing how big this pileup is getting to be. And I get to 41, and I'm stopped. The one that triggered me with number 41 was I had seen a statistic that said that for people in poverty, there seems to be a difference in the brain surface area, like around 6% change. And what I realized was I didn't know anything about the brain. At the time, I was getting some individual counseling for a personal problem that I was dealing with. And the counselor said, you ought to read The Developing Mind by Daniel Siegel. So I said, yeah, that's a good idea. So I got the book, and it was a few sessions later, I went back to him and I said, your book is killing me. I was having a hard time with the terminology, what we were what the whole book deals with. And then he told me, he said, well, they use this book for med students. Well, I'm a retired math teacher and not a med student, but I stuck with it because I kept finding things in there. For instance, Siegel would talk about if a kid is under a lot of pressure and overwhelmed by stressors, for instance, the HPA axis, which we'll get into in a while here, the HPA axis might be permanently impaired. I'm thinking, wait a minute, that is what happens to kids in poverty. I started finding more and more of these things popping up for me, some of which I'll be able to share with you here today. So I read the book and I stuck with it. And then after I got done reading The Developing Mind, I started all over and I read it again. I read it a second time. And then I read it a third time and a fourth time. And by then I really was starting to get to know what I was doing here. For instance, integrative fibers. I found out that, when a child is born, the child has about 100 billion brain cells, each of them able to connect to 10,000 others. And they do start connecting at the rate of about 1 million connections every second. And one of the things that are very important here for that development are integrative fibers, because none of the specialized areas of the brain are developed when a child is born. Thought process is not developed. The emotional center, those are all in different places. Memory center, of course, is a while away from being developed. But the integrative fibers between all of these areas of the brain are now starting to be developed. And if a child lives in poverty with all these stressors, then these integrative fibers can be impaired. So you get stress buildup, cognition problems. Well, I'm going to just look at the geometry of this situation I'm still piling on I'm listing for myself. And all of these things were things that impacts that I could cite someplace in some of the medical journals. And I was starting to get into some of the National Institutes of Health documents and abstracts, and CDC puts them out too, but NIH is really helpful with this. And finally, I reached near the end of my list of impacts that just you can get disorders like PTSD and some others. And finally, number 90 is born. Children in poverty are born into this whole list of 90. People in poverty then live with a whole list of 90 impacts all of the time. So not only is this child going to be born into that, but his parents are living that list. And so are his brothers and sisters, and his neighbors, and his relatives, and all the neighbors around them, all dealing with all of these impacts all of the time. And this is what it looks like all together. I thought I would just put them up here. If you want to see something on there eventually, you get a chance to, in a couple of minutes, we can ask questions about what I mean by any of the things on here, if you'd like to ask about that now. So one night, my wife and I are in the library at 58 School, which I'm looking at right now. It's out my bedroom window is number 58 School. So we're in the library there, and local columnist Erica Bryant had read this book, which is called Our Kids, by Robert Putnam. He's a Harvard scientist, and and so Erica had gotten Volkan Vargas, who was the superintendent of schools then, over to 58 School to discuss that book that night. And so we went over there and had a discussion, and that was kind of interesting. Vargas was pretty close to being on the way out at the time. I liked the guy. I thought he had a good heart. One of the things he said there that night was, in this struggle for his budget problems, I've managed to get one social worker for every high school and middle school. And my math teacher brain put that together, and I'm saying one social worker, 700 kids, none of this just made sense. So it occurred to me after I decided to list these words, these 90 impacts in this way, that some other benefits came out of this, just seeing it like this. Because I was thinking one day, supposing Vargas could have solved all of his problems as a superintendent. In other words, suppose he was able to do everything he wanted to do as an educator. In other words, all the kids would be up to snuff with vocabulary, every single one of them. Suppose he could get every kid going to college and going to getting the college fit that child needed. Supposing they weren't absent from school, supposing they could go every day, and supposing they had good discipline, they all graduated, they all got their of course, would have a GED then. They all took APs. Their teachers were respected. They were never suspended from school. Supposing all of the things that Vargas was supposed to do, he was able to do with his teachers and get all of this across to the kids. What would happen to this list of 90? So let's take out all of those things that Vargas would be doing because they wouldn't be problems anymore. And let's see what's left. So let's do that here. Well, there they go. This is what walks in the door at school every day. So this has nothing to do with school, really, but it has a lot to do with school. Education would probably temper some of the things that you see up in here. So if you have any questions about any of the things that you see up here, you want to take a look at that for a second, and I'll let you know what I was thinking when I used that as an impact.
John, that's an impressive list. One of the things with the brain, half the books behind me are part of my research on my dissertation that had to do with the brain, and that is that not only what happens, what you mentioned regarding children having the trauma and stress that children of bone crunching poverty experience. With the recent research, it's been demonstrated that this trauma and stress literally changes the structure of the brain itself. And that's a pretty scary thing.
Yeah, it is. That's one of the things we'll get into here. In fact, it even goes deeper than the brain. It goes all through the body.
Well, that's the lead.
Let's hang on to that one, and I'll show you that. I'm going to get into some specifics with the science here in a few seconds.
Did you put lead poisoning on this, John?
No, I didn't. Yeah.
Well, you know,
I'm actually
that's
interested to know. The book I'm reading right now is What the Eye Cannot See. It has to do with this pediatrician trying to discovering and then trying to do something about the Flint, Michigan water supply. So, yeah.
When I'll agree with what you just said, and the fact that not only does lead affect the brain, it affects all systems and organs in the body to make the child irritable, stomach aches, a lack of sleep, kidney function, digestion, impulsivity, judgment. You name it, it does it. And children of poverty are lead poisoned at a much higher rate than children who are not of poverty. And that's why I called it the silent and invisible monster that's devouring our children.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you see. What the lead poisoning really just exacerbates almost everything that you see up here on the screen.
Exactly.
But then they fall prey to it more because they're in the old homes. Probably even worse than the lead paint is what happened with the use of lead in gasoline, and also what happened with the deterioration of our lead pipes and the water delivery system, and which was kept under wraps. Deliberate lies told about that so that people could make more money.
Yeah, exactly. And it was demonstrated in a formal peer-reviewed study that when they took lead out of gasoline, the amount of murders in the United States trailed off exactly, coinciding with the lead taken out of gasoline. And it depends city by city, but if the water is treated properly, like it is in Rochester, it won't deteriorate the lead pipes that go from the main water source into the house. But you can see what happened in Flint when they changed that system. It just was explosive.
Yeah.
Well, John, it sounds like you should probably add lead poisoning to the list and make it 91 at least.
You know, it's like Wade Norwood said, he thinks there may be 100. So if I go, I could, I in no way say that my list is all there is.
Well, no, but John, you're absolutely right. You may want to just put lead poisoning as something that exacerbates almost all of them, probably all of them.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Well, let's put that one definitely somewhere to be added and considered. And John, if you want to continue, go ahead.
If you go 91, that'll be good with me. All right, let's continue here. So let's take a look at some of the microscopic effects. I think it's worth taking a look at this. And one of them would be poverty and body cells. So what happens is you get these stressors that build up, and the brain detects them, tapes them in through the sensory system. Massive stressors from traumas. These would be like any of the things that you see from the old the ACEs, you know, the childhood adverse childhood problems. traumas that come along. And stress, once it enters the brain, then the brain can take it throughout the whole central nervous system. And it can pass, in other words, it takes the stress, passes it off to the neurons carry it around to the chromosomes, whatever they are. Actually, we'll find out in a few seconds. And then the chromosomes react by creating morbidity in the problem. Sometimes this is called DNA aging, and it can just be morbid problems with like obesity, like diabetes, like hypertension. So let's take a look at how that happens, and how it happens is kind of interesting, and in a way that I think we all have to know about. There are some terms here that we must know now these days. So with the diagram here, I apologize if science was not your thing. Don't shrink away here. We'll take you by the hand and carry you through this one. Take a look at this over here. The three main parts. This is a cell. This is your body cell. Your body has about 37 trillion of these. They make up your bones, your skin, your hair. And inside your cells are the chromosomes. And one of the jobs of the chromosome is, if a cell gets weak, then, or is not doing its job, then the chromosome will tell the cell to divide itself. And the cell will divide itself in two. You get an identical replacement, and hopefully the replacement cell will be a nice healthy one. And then the other sickly cell either gets absorbed into the body or may sometimes be used to shore up another part of the body. Now, that's if things go the way we would like them to go. After the split, we get a healthy cell. The problem is right down in here. This little part of the chromosome is called a telomere. And as long as that telomere is nice and long and healthy and protects the end of the chromosome, you will get nice replacement cells up here. But if the telomere gets short, then we get some problems. And one of the problems with this is that telomeres are already critically shorter in children who live in poverty. What that means is this cell up here, the replacement cell, may not be as healthy as it's supposed to be. So what happens then? Well, then that cell cries out to the body for help. The body sends in fluids. Fluids can't penetrate the cell. Fluids build up, you get inflammation. Inflammation and buildup of fluids is exactly the kind of situation that cancers love. Crohn's disease, celiac disease, cardiovascular problems also. And there are plenty of others. So what happens then with a shortened telomere, you start to develop other problems. Now, remember when COVID-19 hit, one of the things we learned there was that comorbidity was a problem here. Remember, there were three particular areas of people who were really hit hardest with COVID. Once they got it, they were devastated more by it. And one of those groups was the group of people in poverty. Shortened telomeres were what did that. The second group was also people of color. And what happens is, we'll be able to take a look a little bit later in here, we'll be able to see that the effects of racism are felt all the way down to the telomeres here. They effectively reduce the telomere size, and so that people of color now are more prone to this second morbidity, so that when you get COVID-19, that's one morbidity. The comorbidity is the second situation that might develop from shortened telomeres. The third group of people who were affected were people like me. I'm 78. So as you age, what happens is, you see here, that's what's going on in this section of the diagram. Every time you get a cell division, the telomere gets shorter. more and more cell divisions over time, and the telomeres get shorter. And I'm going to move this down here because you see eventually what happens. If you live long enough, then what happens is the telomeres are gone. You get only senescent cells here, and they can't handle the load. And so that's why when we get old enough and we can't fight off the sicknesses anymore, and then that's it for us. By the way, you get 50 cell divisions if you can make it to the end. It's called the Hayflick limit. Well, so chromosomes being affected like this and shortened telomeres is just one of the 90 impacts. So we got another 89 to go here. Stressors of poverty invade the body. So they hit the neurons take them to the HPA axis. The HPA axis has to do with cortisol. This is the HPA axis is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis. And we see those effects in a situation like this. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and we see a child in poverty here on a regular basis. She may be trying to deal with her mom's depression, which of course might bring on cortisol to help her cope with that. With trauma, maybe she's beaten on a regular basis. We know that poverty is the #1 predictor of child abuse. Fear, maybe there are gangs on the corners. When she's trying to get to school, cortisol is delivered. Maybe she gets abused. Fight, flight, freeze. Here's a gunshot, more cortisol. Cortisol, 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 cortisol. If this child gets to school with all that much cortisol in her system, she's not going to be a good learner. Cortisol is really effective in preventing good learning. As Dr. Rogish told us, what happens now is that the body sees that there's a buildup of too much cortisol and now tries to stop the cortisol production. But she needs the cortisol, but she can't have that much cortisol because that will start to destroy synapses between neural cells. So there's a problem here, and what happens eventually is her stress regulation might be impaired, and we see this with kids in school. They can't handle themselves, can't handle their own stress, and cognitive skills can be diminished. A third thing that happens, and then I'll stop with that stuff, the genes are affected. The genes may be silenced. It's a process called epigenesis. And I had, where I was this summer, I had some people asking me about my book, and then we got to talking about this one woman said, well, maybe it's bad genes. I said, no, the genes are the same across humanity. We've all got the same genes, basically. But what happens is under this undue stress, the genes may be silenced. In other words, they get switched off. So the overwhelming stress starts to switch off genes that now are not doing the jobs that they're supposed to be doing. So epigenetic factors are also part of this. So what happens then? The child's executive functions are impaired. And that's why she's looking at this and saying, why can't I get this? And it's not her. It's what's being done to her by poverty and the impacts here. She will have affected in her skills for planning, memory. This is response flexibility and impulse control, all of them. By the way, it's not only people like, kids in poverty get affected this way. Well, I'm gonna leave that one alone. Now, a different area, aside from what's going on in the underlying science in the body to undermine things, we have a discourse difference. In poverty, well, let me just say it, in any society, There are 5 registers of language, and 2 of them get used in the same way in almost every culture across the world. There's a formal register, and that is the register of discourse used by middle class, school, and business. And then there's a casual register, which tends to be the discourse of poverty. And it doesn't matter whether you look at it here. Sometimes you might call it African American English, might be used. It is kind of like that. I noticed when I was in Boonville, Kentucky, you could hear different registers down there that it's very hard to understand what's being said. If you go to Kenya or any other place in the world, you're going to find the same kind of thing. If people are, what happens is formal register is used by middle class, school, and business because it's for completing tasks, and it's very efficient for doing that. But casual register is a little harder to understand. Why does it come about? Well, it's for relationships. And this happens particularly with oppressed people because they're looking for a way to feel like the rest of the group. And the other important thing here is relationships are crucial in poverty because your friends help you stay alive. So there's a lot of sharing that goes around in poverty. And what I have may be what you need, and you are entitled to it. There's an awful lot of sharing there. Potential problems with differences in registers here. This kid's used to hearing casual register if he's from poverty, his teacher speaks in formal register. That's a disconnect, a slight problem there. They're speaking the same language, but this delivery is different than the way he's used to hearing things and dealing with spoken words. And here's another potential problem. Teacher's problem is the posture is formal. Dad needs signs of trust here. He's used to casual register. He's used to formal register. He could be a teacher, could be a doctor, he could be a detective, whoever it is. In this case, if he gives maybe a little casual register in the beginning, de-escalating of tensions here, maybe Dad in that case is looking at this guy and saying, maybe I can trust this guy. Maybe I can listen to what he's got to say about my son. So I also want to talk a little bit more about language with this. The Hart-Risley test, what they were able to find was that parents talk a lot less to their kids, are talked to by their kids a lot less. The vocabulary is affected. This is for kids in poverty. And one of the things that they also found was that parental encouragements versus prohibits per hour, encouragements versus discouragements, like don't do that, to look like this. Advantage parents, and this would be parents with, let's say, a couple of, where you had 2 parents who were professionals, were giving 32 positives and 5 negatives to their kids. And this was over the course of an hour. Poverty parents were giving 5 positives and 11 negatives to their kids over an hour. You'd say it doesn't make sense. Again, if you look at genetics and genes, I mean, DNA across humanity, why would this happen? But it does make sense when you think about what's piled on top of these people. If you're dealing with these 90 impacts, you're probably going to come across in a negative way. And many of your thoughts are going to be negative. Even how you judge yourself is going to be negative. And that transfers over to the kids. Now, these statistics come from kids who are from 7 months to 3 years old. That's a critical period. This is in the 0 to 3 age range, and that's doing what Ralph mentioned before. This is when the mind is being shaped. And if this is what's doing it, well, here's what I think it shows. I'm going to, as you take a look at these, this 32 positives and 5 negatives over here, it's about a 7-to-1 ratio. And positives to negatives here is about a 1-to-2 ratio here, positives to negatives. What I want to do is see what the effects of that might be. I wanted to measure this out graphically. So what I did was I thought in Daniel Siegel's book, he said when you're faced with a challenge, like a parent saying yes or no to you, what you do is your arousal system says to you, wait a minute, something is about to happen here. And then you evaluate the challenge. If it's positive, if you evaluate as positive, you go for the challenge. If you evaluate the challenge as negative, you withdraw. So let's see how that works with given these parental positives and negatives here. I'm going to keep track of a child with advantaged parents versus a child with parents who live in poverty and see what happens here. We might expect anyway. So this kid is going to get more positives. And as he does, each time he gets a positive, he's probably going to be willing to approach a challenge. Good boy, Johnny. I'm going to keep track of this by footsteps. Way to go, Johnny. That's it, Johnny. Oh, you're doing a good job, Johnny. That's it, Johnny. Good boy. That's it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's the 7 positives. Here comes the negative. Johnny, stop that. And he withdraws. Now, what Siegel says is when the parent gives a negative like that, the child feels shame, and now the parent has to ameliorate that situation. Well, let's look down here at what happens with the child in poverty. 1 positive for 2 negatives. Good boy, Johnny.
I'm leaving soon, so.
Johnny, stop that. Johnny, get back on the couch. This is what's happening over the course of an hour for a child between 7 months and 3 years of age. I think you can start to make some predictions here. I mean, who is more likely to finish high school and probably go on to college, and who is not more likely to do that? Does that mean this kid can't do that? No. But the odds are really cut down. And this is really what we see happening now, especially in the world of education, in our Rochester City schools, where we have such high and concentrated poverty. Hart and Risley, over the course of an hour, it looked like this for advantaged kids there and disadvantaged kids there. Advantaged kids would be about 27 steps ahead after an hour, and disadvantaged kids and kids who live in poverty would be withdrawing, are practicing withdrawal more. These are the kinds of things also that Robert Putnam in his Our Kids book also measured, had some graphs to show what happens in the area of withdrawal. So another thing I want to consider here is just the differences we have between living in poverty and as opposed to living in middle class and wealth. I don't know, do we understand what's going on in the other area, in the other realm? It's hard for us to do that. Here's a prediction to make. What's the main concern, do you think, would be for people living in generational poverty? What would you predict they would be most worried about or most concerned?
Survival.
Maybe survival. Food. Maybe food.
I'll chime in with belonging.
Belonging.
Yep.
Now, I have to tell you, I don't know the answer to this question, but I think I do. I was helping mentor, I was helping train mentors for people to help out with the self-sufficiency program at ABC. And Sean Futch was the director of the program, and she told us about Sandy Hope, who was a life counselor there, had said to the people in the self-sufficiency program, she said, anytime you want to get together with me on a Thursday, we'll come in, spend an hour, and you can, and we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. And then Sandy told Sean what she said, this is what people want to talk about. So their main concern seemed to be and that's one of those that just hits me in the heart. And when you think about it, the differences in the two, in the classes that we have, just some of the answers that we came up with here. Usually if you're thinking about what's the main concern for people living in generational poverty, we don't live there, but we start thinking of it in terms of our middle class or wealth values. What would be important for us? How would this strike us? And you can start to see how when you're there, you see things in a totally different way. It's shame is a major factor in poverty. And one of the killers is you can't even feed your kids properly. And that is devastating. So, any questions or?
John, I know Janelle Crocker had a question. Janelle, you want to ask your questions?
Oh, yes. Thank you. I've been listening. And first, I want to say thank you so much for sharing this. This is very insightful and helpful. I had a question. Yes.
No, I just want to say hi and thank you.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Go ahead.
I wrote it. Well, I think I tried to take note that you were talking about it a few slides back. You were talking about the former register versus casual register.
Right.
And I just had a clarifying question. When you use that word register, are you talking about the actual language used in the word choice in talking with individuals? Because you talked about the formal register is what's being used by teachers with children versus the casual register, which is used for like relationships and building trust. So is that what you're referring to, the actual word choice and vocabulary being used?
Yes, it can involve the word choice. Usually it involves a smaller vocabulary because it's for developing friendships and encouraging, a camaraderie. You want to be sure you're together. And so even the way you tell stories, that is affected. How you frame things is affected.
Okay.
But also the fact that, where I really learned about casual register, I was worried about that when I first heard, I learned that from Ruby Payne, who writes about these things. And I liked that. I knew I suspected that she was right about that, but I didn't like the casual part because I thought maybe that was a pejorative.
Mm-hmm.
But where I really learned about casual register was one night I was doing one of these presentations, and it was from a Native American woman was there, and she said, you know, you got that part about casual register, right? And I thought, oh, okay, this is cool. And she said, you know, you come to see us on the res, and you better be prepared to spend a couple of hours. We're going to sit down and get to know each other. And that's usually when the language drops in formality. Then we can start saying things like, yeah, that's really neat, you know, and stuff like that. Hey, bro, that kind of language now all of a sudden becomes acceptable. Whereas in a business meeting, you're probably not going to be talking about things in that way.
John?
Yeah.
Yeah.
John?
Mm-hmm.
This is Ralph Spezia. You mentioned Ruby Payne. I have her book right here. And I'm about to buy your book. Listen, I think it's fascinating. I want to follow up a little bit with the formal register, casual register. You know, intuitively, it struck me when I was even a rookie teacher is that in sixth grade I taught. I loved it. That children would write like they speak. You know, it wasn't formal. There wasn't standard English. It was more colloquial. And it struck me, I said, listen, that's not wrong. How you speak is not wrong. When I'm with my friends or I'm with my Italian relatives, I speak differently.
Hey, Goomba, yeah.
Yeah, that's not, and the way I speak with my friends or my Italian relatives, it is not wrong. That's not wrong. However, if I'm speaking to Board of Education or a corporate board, I'll use standard English. And I said, let's play a game here. So we can speak naturally, but for the period of time when I announce, I'm going to speak to you in standard English. I'm going to ask you a question in a full sentence, and then I'm going to ask you to answer that question in a full sentence. And it was absolutely remarkable. And what I learned was, when we learn language, we tune our ear to that language. In other words, if someone was singing out of tune, we'd all wince. So if our ear is tuned to the formal register or standard English, when we don't hear it, we kind of go like, what? And if I were to go to even in the United States with different people speaking a different dialogue, it may take me, as a matter of fact, years and years ago, I went to the Adirondacks and to get pump gas, and the gas station attendant came out and talked to me, and it was a strain for me to understand what he was talking about. I mean, I had to tune my ear to it. And so once we started playing that game and had children tune their ear to the formal register, then I noticed a big difference in their writing. I also had a teacher, I'll make this short. I had a teacher every day when the children came in, she put a paragraph of a continuing story that she composed on the blackboard. This is third grade. And she made mistakes, run-on sentences, the poor verb tense, so on and so forth. And the children had a notebook, and they would correct it, and then all together they would make the corrections on the board. By about the half of the year, those children were writing compositions that would knock your socks off. And I asked her, how are you doing that? And she told me, and it was just incredible. The way we speak culturally or informally, it certainly is not wrong, but I think it's a responsibility to have our children tune their ear to all types of language. And I feel if we don't do that, then we're cheating them. How do you feel about that?
I agree. I think that we have to, in this society especially, I think we have to teach them the formal register. But I think we have to not shame them.
Yes, that's right.
They
That's
have
right.
to know that, yes, the way you're speaking, with the casual register here is what you do with your friends. And there are other times when you may want to use it. But then there's a formal register that is important for you to use for more than one reason.
Yeah, I was so important that I really emphasized over and over and over again, the way you speak culturally, the way you speak casually is not wrong. Actually, it's beautiful.
John, Ralph, I just want to jump in here just as the taskmaster here. That we've got about a half hour left, so I'm just giving you that information, John.
Okay.
Go with it as you please.
I'm excited with John's presentation. Thanks, Dan.
Oh, Don, you had your hand up?
Yeah, John, I want to talk to you about two things. The first one is a recommendation. The National Council of Teachers funded a research project by Marling, M-A-R-L-I-N-G, and Lucas in 2009. Now, this is important to your work because this research is very critical of heart and research. And if you go to Google, you can pick it right up.
Okay.
It's something that I've used in my work with literacy. But this is my big question. On your jacket, your book jacket, it says that you were looking to find the answer to this question: why poverty has remained so resilient. Now, those are your words, right? My question is to you, why do you think, after all this wonderful work you've done, why has poverty remained so resilient? Is it because of those 90 impacts? Some must be more important. I'm having a little trouble knowing what your conclusions are.
Okay. What I think is going on here, since with poverty generally, we're talking about a class thing. Now, race enters into it. We'll get to that in a few seconds here. But what I think has happened is we have a colossal failure in our economic system that allows this to happen, in fact, even forces this to happen in ways that most recently, what Ralph was talking about with lead poisoning was allowed and fostered actually without any regard to what the consequences were going to be.
That's
and
right.
What we see is that's just one example of a case where people who need an out can't get it. They can't find it. So what happens when you get into poverty like this, and now you can't have your needs met, and now these things start piling up one after the other after the other. It's very difficult to get out. And not only is it difficult to get out, but once you get out, it's hard to leave it behind. Almost every time I do a presentation like this, I'll give you an example. The last one was in Buffalo. The last time we were allowed to see people in person. And I was doing the same presentation for some people who were going to be chaplains, hospital chaplains. And they were all different religions. And as usual, one person hangs around lingers after everybody goes. And then she says, she said, my dad was raised in poverty. He was one of 10 kids. And she said, he became an engineer. He got out, he became an engineer. But he still, like when he's an electrical engineer, if he buys a circuit breaker, he has to buy 10. He's only going to use one, and he can't, and he knows it's wrong to be buying these other 9, but he just needs to have them there. He buys things 10 at a time. He can't get out of it. He can't leave. And that's how deep this goes.
Yeah.
It's really incredible.
Thank you, John.
I got to say, because you're interested in language, particularly at Chautauqua last year, I heard a speech pathologist her name was Julie Washington, a black woman from Georgia State University, was talking to us about languages. It was fascinating. You would have loved this. And one of the incidents she ran into, she told us that she was working with a backwoods or a coastal child who was really, out of the mainstream. And so she was teaching using the book, Are You My Mother? And it's where a little bird lands on the head of a dog and says, "Are you my mother?" And then the dog says, "No, I am not your mother." So then the bird flies off to a different animal. "Are you my mother?" "No, I am not your mother." And so Julie said, so I said to her, "Okay, now you tell me the story." And the girl thought for a minute, and she said, "Is you my mama? I ain't know your mama." And Julie said, so I thought, we've got a disconnect here. And then she said, after she thought about it for a few minutes, she thought, wait a minute. What was happening was that Julie was expressing this in one dialect. The child was hearing this story, taking the whole story in, memorizing the whole story, converting it to her language, and then reporting it all correctly in her own language. Just incredible. So it's kind of like what we were talking about, Ralph before mentioned with the different dialects even. What we have to be careful about is judging. We hear something different than the language we're used to. First thing we think maybe in our minds is, "Oh, that's stupid, why are they talking like that?" But all of the different languages we use may be important for us with that particular community where we've grown up. But of course, if this is in this country, you need to know about formal register. And I know in different kinds of communities, I know in the Black community, it's called code switching. You know when to switch from maybe your neighborhood talk to what's going to get you the job if you sit in for a job interview. But you have to be aware of those things and know to do that. And I think our kids have to be made in tune with that so that they can deal with it.
John, I'm particularly interested in hearing more about the impact of racism and its relationship to poverty, and also the implications of the recent developments over the last couple of weeks as well in terms of national and worldwide outrage about the impact of negative justice, so to speak.
I think we can speak directly about that stuff. This happened in a conversation that I had with Calvin Eaton. He's with 540 West Main Street Incorporated. It's a little organization on Main Street. He holds classes now. He's been doing this for about 4 years, and he's got a wonderful blog. I will eventually give you the information about that. And so we're talking, and he said, the average Black kid gets 5 racial discrimination experiences every day. And I thought, wow, 5 a day? Well, that's probably coming from us white people. And we tend to do this without even knowing we're doing it. I think Robin DiAngelo in her book White Fragility makes a great case for this and kind of releases the denial that most of us have that we're doing this somehow, but we've been inundated with it since we were little kids. But we have to be aware. The average Black teen experiences 5 racial discrimination experiences every day. Well, in school and out then, and that means Black teens receive 35 racial slights per week, or 1,820 a year. In other words, 10,920 by the time they graduate high school, or 18,200 by college graduation. And by the time she gets her doctorate, 29,000 by doctoral graduation. She wasn't here for this one, but I heard Leslie Myers Small talk about her school experience with 5 other kids on a panel in Pittsford about a couple of years ago. This was, and I took notes, and I remember her. She had, a couple of incidents. They were all asked about, well, can you give us some incidents? One of hers was someone asked her, did she really write her doctoral thesis? And how people come up with these things, I don't know, but people say them, and it's got to be devastating when you hear some thing like that. So they'd be hearing 50,960 by age 40. And if we go back now, this is if you start from the teen years. If you go back to when they were born, you get 72,800 slights by age 40 if your preteen years are figured in. And we know that they should be, because we know by age 3, white kids have already determined their superiority. You can go to Rutgers, Google Rutgers and Black teens, and you'll come up with that if that's something you want. So you have a child then like this one. This is not the child in poverty. This may be a kid in Fairport, let's say. Let's say she has 2 professional parents, but she gets frowned at. If she goes home with a white boy, I can guarantee you the white mom is going to, after school, the white mom is going to look and there's going to be a frown. There's going to be at least a look of surprise. Guidance counselors still can tell a child like this to take easy math. Calvin Eaton was told not to go to any Ivy League schools. She might be followed in the store. At least eyes will be following her. I know a couple in Pittsford. He's white, she's Black. They're both professional people. They have children of color. And Mark said sometimes when they go shopping, they'll split up, the two, he and his wife, and just to watch what happens. And he said when his wife is alone in the store, the body language on the clerks and customers around is totally different. This girl is going to be feeling this all of the time. There were driveway leaflets in Pittsford recently. It devastated the community, and people were just scared. I mean, the kids. A lot of people now have children of color, and they couldn't believe it. This was happening there. And it frightened the devil out of the kids. Can I touch your hair? Is frequently asked. Invasion of body space. I'm going to guess that after every one of these things here, I'm going to go back here, right there, cortisol, 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 cortisol. This child is going to be feeling the cortisol and the stressors on a regular basis. Her stress regulation is going to be impaired. And she probably, though, because her parents have enough means, might be able to get the professional help to get over that, to deal with that. cognitive skills might very well be diminished. If she's going to school with cortisol buildup, she's definitely going to be affected in school. But again, if her parents are of means, then they may be able to deal with this as a problem. Micro, and this is cool. I'm just writing an article about this, which I'm going to try to locate soon. Micro and macroaggressions affect the physiology of both the sender and receiver. And this is something that I think we don't give enough attention to. This girl is getting 5 racial incidents a day directed at her. The thing is, where are they coming from? They're coming from some white child, and almost always a white child. That means that white child is delivering 5 racial incidents a day. And where must those things be kept? Well, they're in the neural nets. And that's physiological. As you start building up neural nets, it takes synapses to connect those nets, the neurons together. That is physical. There is a physical change when kids deal with racial acts like this. And it's kind of like what happens with the kids in poverty. There are physical changes in there. Like Ralph said before with the brain, those neural connections are being made based on the poverty that they live in. It's physical.
You know, John, you bring, I'll do this quick, you bring back memories. When I was 3 years old, my family moved from Rochester to a town in 1950 that was very white, Protestant Anglo-Saxon. And I was the only very dark-skinned Italian kid in that whole town, in that town. And I remember very overt and covert racism. That the covert didn't really strike me. The overt did. And when I was successful, in spite of that, but I'm going to tell you, I went through a period of being very, very angry as a teenager. And if I didn't have a very wise, gentle Sicilian father that guided me, not on the path to Attica, but on the path to straighten myself out, my life would be very, very different. And when I moved to Rochester, finally, after high school, it was like a huge concrete blocks were taken off my shoulders when I saw people who looked like me and shared culture like me. And I'm going to tell you something that really stuck with me. Thank God I drew on that as a teacher and a school principal. What you say is very, very true. I was in a writers group with a woman who was had a young boy over by 36 school a few years back. And when she moved to Geneva, I believe it was Dansville, I think. All of a sudden, she said there was a radical change in her. She just became a whole other person. 36 school is right in the heart of the Crescent there. And it's a tough neighborhood. It definitely affects you. And Ralph, you were white. Yeah.
So you were treated as European, and so you were lifted out. You got kind of a break in that way, and that you didn't have to deal with.
Yeah, there was.
But people who are black cannot get out.
I mean, and there's some stories I still can't shake.
Yeah.
John, we've got 10 minutes left. I just want to let you know.
Okay, I'm close to there. The woman up here that you're looking at is Dr. Amani Allen. She's an epidemiologist, chronic disorders at UC Berkeley. She talked to us at the Chautauqua Institution last year. I heard this lecture. There were about 5,000 of us there, and just knocked me over. And one of the things she mentioned were the curves that you see here. She was talking about the effects of race. and on people. And she said that when I go in a restaurant, the only things that are visible are my color and my gender. And really, when you think about it, that's when the generalizations start happening. People start judging right there based on that. Well, here are the effects on a graph. What she was talking about that day is an axis here. This is age on the bottom, and up here is a predicted probability of what's called allostatic load. Allostasis is when your body functions are all working together in harmony, and so you're in good health. But allostatic load is when the stressors start to build up and now they get in the way, and all of a sudden your body functions are not working together. They may even be working against each other. And allostatic load is a result of all of those stressors. And what happens then is your telomeres start getting shorter. And that's the basis for a lot of the information that you see on this curve. Telomere measure is a way of measuring what's going to happen to you and how you will age. And what's happening here, you'll see on these curves, the faster your curve is rising, the faster you are aging. And you can see on this curve here, this segment of the population is aging fastest. And you look down here and that's Black women. So Black women in the US are aging faster than our Black men, which is on this second curve. And then white women are down here and white men here. And it's interesting, when she did this, she said, let's take somebody who's age 40. Well, in a little joke earlier in her lecture, we could figure out she was age 40 or about there. And so she said, let's just go up to the curve. That's about, I'll figure that off there. So that's a point there for the average 40-year-old Black woman. And let's compare her to a white woman. To do that, we have to get that point, and then we go over this way to the white woman curve, which is right about there. And then we can drop down and we see that a Black woman of age 40 is aging at about the same way a white woman of 50 is. She's getting robbed of 10 years of her age. And this is the thing about racism that should really stun us all. What this woman is doing is working with COVID-19. I saw her on CNN a few weeks back talking about COVID-19. She's trying to stop this thing that's killing all of us. And yet she is forced to age faster than a white woman her age. In fact, faster than anybody else. Now, I decided to write an article for her. It was in the Rochester Beacon. And so I got in touch with her. I said, could you send me some information? I emailed her, and luckily I saw her at Chautauqua coming out of the theater a couple of days later, and she said, I told her about my book. I said, could you send me some information, which she did, and was very helpful with that. So I think the lesson here that we have to take is that these racial slights are adding up into people dying before their time. Another person who has more information on this is Wade Norwood's organization has done quite some studies on aging, premature aging like this. So, not explained by, I'm going to just move you guys down here for a second, by DNA or genes, would be hypertension, diabetes. In Black people, this is comorbidity, which means chronic disease and also chronic disease clusters. COVID-19 death rates increased by 3 times. Birth delivery deaths 4 times higher. There's an incredible article about Serena Williams when she was delivering her child and telling the doctors, I can't breathe, and the nurse saying, well, you go through that now. It's not a regular. She said, no, something is wrong here. I think I've developed some clots. And they said, no, you have, it's not what you think it is. Well, it was what she thought it was, and she almost died. Black men in the USA have high blood pressure. Hypertension runs rampant in the Black male community. Black men in Africa, normal blood pressure. This is what racism is doing. This is physical. This is not like doing something that's going to get somebody's goat or something and then you forget it. This is physical. So 5 racist acts a day, 70,000 approximately through age 40. How does it get in there? This is what John Lewis said about it in his book, Walking with the Wind. He says it was the dying in their own lives, the little deaths they felt every day, the little deaths they felt every day of hope, opportunity, and belief. This is a fantastic book, by the way. I don't know if you know about John Lewis. He's a congressman. There's the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. They were crossing on the way to the walk to Montgomery, and he was right in the front of that group. He was wearing a beige coat, and they got to the other side of the bridge, and the sheriffs were there, and they said, "You have 1 minute to stop this." And then the police closed on him.
Yeah, we almost killed him.
Yeah, he got a nightstick to the head. He got a fractured skull. He was in the hospital for quite a while. Incredible book, Walking with the Wind. So that's what I have.
John, one of the major questions I think that the coalition has to deal with, I mean, this is a very powerful presentation, and your book is just as powerful.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
But I think the question that we need to deal with, and we're going to have to spend some time on it at our next meeting, is basically what are the implications now in terms of your presentation for the coalition, in terms of our goals, our objectives, our mission? What do we want to do, if anything, that's significantly different because of this presentation and your book? So I'm kind of challenging myself and the rest of the coalition, and you too, John, since you're part of our group too, in terms of what should we do differently, if anything. And I don't expect an answer to that question now, because I think we need to spend some time with it.
No, that's good, and I already have some ideas here.
Great.
Yeah,
I have some
I
ideas
think
as
about
well.
that.
Other folks other than me and Ralph asking questions and Bart?
Eleanor, I'm delighted to see you. Holy mackerel, you got to join us more often.
Hi, I was just saying, I gotta go. This was very, very helpful. Really good information. My daughter is doing epidemiology, so I sent her a link to Dr. Amani Allen. I took a lot of notes. It was really good. So I guess it means buy the book.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
John,
Thank you.
Perhaps, Eleanor, you'll consider joining us in our. I know you're doing a lot of stuff and you're so busy, but boy, we could use your input. Believe me.
Somebody
Thank you
else
so much.
was trying just to talk. Who was that?
oh, that was Ed. John, if you can still hear me, I'm wondering, is the U.S. unique? Is it like what you and Bart were talking about? Is it the economy, our culture? Or have you found some places, any other diverse populations that have less impacts than that you're finding here?
I have to say, in general, Ruby Payne made the remark, minorities always seem to take it on the chin. But I don't think anywhere is like this country. You have such a disparity between the top and the bottom. And I think what's happening with the middle class is we're slowly shrinking down into, it's almost like a two-class system that we're growing into. So there's that kind of gap here. And so
I would also say that if you look at the ramifications of Black Lives Matter all over the world, how quickly everyone jumped onto that,
Yeah.
I think that's an indicator that this is pretty much a standard around the globe.
Yep.
Although I do think the United States has a more critical problem.
mhm.
Yeah, one of the things that we should look at a bit, and maybe you've got some data on it. I mean, I was born in Belgium in 1943, and by 44, the Allies had come through, pushed the Nazis out, and I never really had any major problems as a child that I was aware of. I came here when I was 7, and that was quite a shock to the system. I didn't speak a word of English at the time. And I was lucky in that I came to a small town in central Massachusetts where there really weren't that many people who spoke French, so it was a total immersion situation as far as learning the language. And that leaves a few scars because for a few years you feel like a real dummy. The only kid who goes to shut the door when they tell you to shut the window. But I look at the bilingual education that goes on in Rochester and in a lot of cities in the country these days, and I wonder, is it a plus or is it a minus to have children basically kept in a bilingual environment? I mean, I always spoke French at home with my parents, but whenever I was out with friends, we were speaking English. For neighborhoods that are predominantly Hispanic, kids, of course, have the ability to just go out and speak Spanish with their friends. Do we have any information as to what's the best way to try to deal with the language issue in schools? You know, are you better off trying to put kids into a total immersion classroom setting so they learn English as rapidly as possible, but may feel embarrassed that they are not speaking English right away? Or do you keep them in a bilingual class situation where it may take them twice as long to get up to speed in the English language?
Probably going to need some expertise here to answer that one.
You're out of my realm there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think, given the time, what I'd like to suggest, because we did agree on an hour and a half, is that I'm going to put out a proposal for the next meeting and hopefully get some feedback in terms of a good time for next week, in which we can discuss not only the implications of John's presentation for the coalition, but also several other important agenda items we have. So with that, John, I thank you, and I'm sure everybody else thanks you too.
Well, thank you guys very much.
Presentation, and I think, as I said before, that if I would have had this information years ago, I would have been a better teacher, a better principal, and a better human being. It's powerful stuff. So,
in leaving it, Dan, I think what you just said is central to the coalition and the work we have to do in the meeting you're going to have. Unless you experience this stuff, part of it or all of it, it usually flies over our head, even the most well-meaning people. Unless we have experiences like John underlines and we're made sensitive to this, then the things will go on as they are. So
well, that's what we've got to talk about at the meeting.
Schools and police and everyone else, John's presentation is central.
Yeah.
So thank you again, John. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and we'll meet again hopefully next week.
Thank you, John. Thank you.